Moneyball for everything, Moneyball for sports, Moneyball for investing, Moneyball for the army. The concept of Moneyball, introduced by Billy Beane at the Oakland A's and then sort of internalized by Michael Lewis in his book Moneyball, basically says that when you play a game, a sports game, when you play war, invest, whenever you're in a competitive situation, there are two ways to allocate resources. One way is to allocate as many resources as you can to win the game. In other words, the richer you are, the more resources you have, the higher the likelihood of winning is. And the other is to find an efficient way to allocate the resources to where it actually matters. And this is the concept of Moneyball. And I want to talk about this today in the application of investing, sports, but also war. Let's look at Ukraine, Russia, and this situation, and maybe find better solutions of how the US should deal with dictators in the future. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's February 18th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 2.1%. The market's down 70 basis points. For the year, we're down 23%. The market's down 8.8%. We're underperforming by 14.2%. The concept of Moneyball, like I said, introduced by Billy Beane at the Oakland A's, says the following. You have Billy Beane, who is given a team and a certain amount of budget. And the problem is that in order to win, he just doesn't have the resources to compete with rich clubs like the Yankees or the Boston Red Sox. And his solution is to use statistics to find more efficient ways to allocate capital. In baseball, that meant to find players that can maximize runs, because what you really want as a team is to win. And in order to win in baseball, you need runs. And in order to get runs, you need certain specific skills that in combination with players could potentially be maximized. In other words, you can get a star player that costs you 20 million per year, or you can get three players that can get you a similar amount of runs, but they might only cost you $1 million a year. So you save 19 million to get the same result. This is the concept of Moneyball in a nutshell, and it is also applicable to, let's say, war. Take an example of the US Army. The US Army costs the American economy an enormous amount of money every year. And unfortunately, I have to say, I believe that we are not as efficient anymore as we used to be, and that's partly because people have figured us out. They know how to fight an army like the US Army. And I think the concept of Moneyball would be very, very useful also for the US Army. And some of it is, I think, also happening. For example, the US Army is focusing a lot more on special operations troops. And this is exactly where I'm going with this. For example, you could think about the following way. In order to deal with people like Putin, you can either build a massive army with massive technology, a lot of manpower, a lot of rockets and all that stuff, or you could just contain the guy. You could, take him out, or at least put him in a position where the cost for him to misbehave on the international stage is very high. For example, find ways to marginalize him, to make his personal life very difficult. So, for example, make it very difficult for him to travel, make it very costly for him to be a private person and things like that. Or, in other words, also build special operations troops which take out important people that surround him, so it's more difficult for him to find allies. So those are the kinds of things that Moneyball would suggest. And again, when I say use the Moneyball method, it's just a metaphor for trying to be more efficient with your resources. Invest more resources in where it really matters. I want to use a tangent here, which I think is amazing, and that is John Danaher, a famous jiu-jitsu coach, and his philosophy of jiu-jitsu, I think, fits very well here. He says that in jiu-jitsu, you are not fighting a person. What you really are trying to do is attack certain parts of a body, be extremely efficient about attacking those parts, and submit the person by compromising that part. So, for example, if you fight a much bigger guy, you could potentially catch his leg and get him what's called a leg lock or a heel hook or something along those lines. Basically compromise his heel, compromise his leg, compromise his neck, compromise the arm. Like, there are things that we humans are vulnerable. And no matter how big we are, or fast, or skilled with martial arts, if we apply a lot of energy and skill to a very specific part of the body, our chances of winning are a lot higher. And this is exactly what Moneyball says. Apply your resources to a very specific part of the game and be very good at that. And you usually will win because your opponent might be applying resources somewhere else. So you're not head to head with them in that particular case. So for example, now if we use this concept in a confrontation with Russia, if you come from Russia as a military power, you're looking at airplanes and rockets and cyber war and all that stuff, where the Russians are maybe not as resourceful as we are, but they have a lot of manpower and resources applied to those things, and we will have a long war of attrition. If instead we would apply very specific skills, so for example, how to marginalize Putin as a person, how to just marginalize him and then threaten with marginalizing him if he invades Ukraine, he might think twice in doing that. So it could cost us a lot less resources to do the same thing. And therefore, I think Moneyball would be very effective in the military space. Like I said, I think the US military has understood that. I know, like say, by listening to an interview with Clayton Christensen, that he was asked by the US military in the late 90s to give a talk about disruption and how the US military felt like they're being disrupted by terrorism and all that stuff. And then we had 9/11. So all these things happen. Also, having read the book, The Red Circle, about the Navy SEALs, and the person who wrote the book, I forgot the name, he says that after 9/11, the US military changed their strategy and became more special operations driven. And I think special operations are a kind of Moneyball, where you use very specific targeted troops of very highly skilled people to get certain jobs done, which potentially could limit the use of other resources like army and personnel and ships and planes and all that. If you, let's say, for example, take out certain specific targets, you don't have to go and bomb the whole country, that kind of thing. So now let's look at Moneyball in the investment space. And when the book came out, Moneyball was a very popular book, and everybody immediately thought about, oh, well, this means, there's undervalued companies and all that stuff. And I think that's partly true, but I don't want to talk about that because I'm not interested in undervalued companies. I think that actually in the financial markets, value is always going to be expensive, meaning real value. And the so-called value companies, so the companies that are cheap relative to other companies, they are cheap for a reason, and you don't want to invest in those. But I think the concept of Moneyball can be used more within the framework of Orange Capital Partners. And the framework of Orange Capital Partners is the natural Sharpe ratio, where we try to maximize the formula of try as many shots on goal as possible, limit your error, limit your mistakes, so don't fail as much, which is sort of under the quotient. And then also, if you fail, lower the cost of error correction. That's kind of the way we look at it. For people that want to know more about it, please go back to our more elaborate episodes where we talk about this kind of stuff. I just want to focus here now on the natural Sharpe ratio and the concept of Moneyball. Because what you want to do as a company, or us investors into companies, what we want to see them do is not just blindly try as many projects as possible, but use the Moneyball concept. Put your resources into those things that really matter. Use the John Danaher concept. Attack competition, let's say, in a specific area that might not be that costly. Let's say Tesla is up against the whole car industry. Well, get very good at, let's say, just build an app that tracks where the car is and lets you open the car. Something like that. A small thing, super useful, kills the competition. By the time they catch up, of course, you already have a lot more other services built on top of your app. So that's one example of how you could easily outdo your competition just by having one little service. Doesn't cost you much. It's not too expensive to do, but it makes a huge difference for the customer. Another example with Tesla, again, using the Moneyball concept, would be mobile service. Again, a small thing, a guy comes to your home, fixes your car, but it's so much more useful. You kill the competition because particularly the traditional car companies, they have a very hard time replicating that. The last thing I want to mention here, which as a Tesla customer, I really enjoy, actually there's two more things where I think Tesla is using the Moneyball concept. One is the autopilot. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. Nevertheless, it's an incredibly useful thing to do, very, very difficult to replicate. And it's just, it's not, it doesn't require billions of dollars of factories and all that kind of stuff. It is so much more useful. And the last thing I want to mention, which is actually probably one of the most underrated thing about Tesla, is the fact that you can go supercharge and the payment is taken care of as a Tesla customer. So you don't have to, have credit cards and all that stuff. And the reason I think this is so crucial is because imagine you're somewhere in the Mojave Desert and for some reason your credit card gets declined or something like that, something along those lines, and you can't charge your car, you're screwed. I know that might not happen very often, even with other networks when they charge with EVgo and stuff, but imagine if there is even a chance that that happens, the amount of frustration, the amount of scare actually you could have. I mean, if you don't have a charge and you're in the Moab Desert in the winter and it's -20 Fahrenheit, this could be dangerous. So again, I think those are small things. And what I want to say here is that our natural Sharpe ratio, of course, is, I think, a very good concept to understand what kind of companies we want to invest in. But I think we also want them to use the Moneyball concept. Use your resources intelligently. Use them a la John Danaher. Attack where it's most efficient, where you get the most results. And I think that's a very nice tool, a useful tool for companies, for investors to look at. And the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. I think this is a very important concept, that you don't just want to blindly invest in companies that do a lot of projects. Every company, particularly in Silicon Valley, is going to tell you, we want to change the world, we have all these projects. You want to think a little bit about, okay, how much Moneyball is here? How much intelligent allocation of resources to where it hurts the most, or to where the payoff is extremely high? Again, the payoff of having a payment network integrated into the supercharging network is immense, even though it's not easy to do, but it doesn't require billions of investment. It just requires to reframe your state of mind. Like, okay, we want to put some resources, we want to put some engineers on this particular problem, let's solve it, and let's go from there. I think that is where it's absolutely at. And maybe just to finish this episode, it's also absolutely crucial to understand that when companies invest in projects, you don't want to be putting your resources, you don't want to do the inverse of Moneyball. What do I mean by that? Take GoPro. GoPro failed not because it's a bad company, bad management, none of that stuff. It's because they were up against Apple. They were putting their resources into getting the best possible camera for action photography and video, and unfortunately that's exactly what Apple also did. So here it's inverse Moneyball. So this would be the equivalent of me attacking a 260-pound guy, and instead of going for the leg lock, I'm trying to do a double leg and take him down wrestling. And I'm 180 pounds. I can't take down a 260-pound guy. I just can't. So this is what GoPro tried to do. So be aware of the inverse Moneyball concept as much as you should be aware of the Moneyball concept. So to summarize, Moneyball, introduced by Billy Beane and eternalized by Michael Lewis in his book, says that you should invest your resources where you have the most gain from your energy and resources, and not just blindly accumulate resources and invest them blindly. The Moneyball concept can be used in war. Like I said, you can, instead of building big armies, just have special operations troops. Some of that is done by the US Army. It can also be used in investing. And the way we use it in investing is not by looking at what's cheap and what's expensive in the market, but we look at companies according to our natural Sharpe ratio concept. And we want our companies to use as much as possible Moneyball ideas when they invest in projects, which means invest in those projects which have the highest return for the resources. Thank you.